Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk you through the process of developing your first roll of film. I'm assuming that your first roll of film will be 35mm film. So as a starting checklist, you need to make sure you have a sheet of negative sleeves for each roll of film that you're about to develop. You can buy them per sheet from Mike's, or you can buy a pack of 25 sheets. You also want to make sure that you have enough time. It takes roughly 1 hour to develop film. The first time you do this process, it might be better to budget about an hour and a half. It varies a lot because it depends on how long it takes you to load your film onto a reel. So again, give yourself a generous amount of time the first few rolls of film you develop. So your initial problem-solving exercise is, how do you get the film out of the canister without exposing it to light? The whole setup of the camera and shooting is designed to not expose film to light outside of when you're shooting each specific frame. So to start explaining how this works, I want to dissect your tank setup. Each tank should have a lid and a tank body. So this specific tank body is designed to hold 2 reels at a time. We have shorter ones that just hold 1. You also will have a funnel, and that allows water and chemistry to easily enter the tank. You'll have a spool, and what I want you to notice about the spool is that each spool has a wider ridge at the bottom, which lets you know that's the bottom of the spool. So the only thing we haven't talked about are the reels, which are what you'll actually load film onto. We'll rewatch this after I've shown you how to load film onto the reel, but just to show you how this system goes together, you'll take the spool first. You will put the reels on the spool. Make sure the bottom of the spool goes in the bottom. Click the funnel firmly into place and top it off with the lid. That's how the system goes together. You'll be grabbing each of these individual components from the film loading room, so you'll only need to grab as many reels as you need. There are taller and shorter tanks, as I mentioned, which go along with taller and shorter spools, but everything else is pretty much interchangeable. I wanted to talk through this system early on so you can understand how light is kept off of your film. So you'll eventually load film onto reels in complete darkness. You will then put those reels onto the spool. Make sure the spool is loaded with the wide ridge side down. That is then followed by putting the funnel on. And immediately, if you think about water or chemistry entering through the funnel, it has to pass through the spool, and it only pools up under the wide ridge at the bottom of the spool. So it's possible for liquid to get into the tank body without much actual light. So that's the system that we're aiming for. Before you actually load your first roll of film, you want to practice loading a dummy roll onto a reel. And that's because your first roll of film is going to be really precious. You want to allow yourself some room to practice, make mistakes. And using a dummy roll lets you do that process in bright light. You'll need to load your actual film in complete darkness. And I'm flashing that here because it cannot be said too many times. To start practicing this process, you'll want to grab at least 1 reel and obviously a roll of dummy film, which I or a lab tech can get for you. So in terms of the reels, looking at the reels first is smart. You want to make sure that not only is the reel clean, dry on the innermost rungs, but also that it's been put together properly. You can see I have these guides here, which are lining up properly. I'll also want to check to make sure that these metallic ball bearings are both in place. Sometimes a reel loses one or both of those, and those help the film load more easily. You also want to check the action, and I'll let you hear the audio for just a second on that. So that's what it should sound like. There's no squeaking, there's no intense resistance as you try to move it back and forth. And just to walk you through it the first time, the action goes something like this. You're moving your hands back and forth. That's how you engage the reel. You should practice that before you even put film on it to make sure that the action is smooth. So now that you're finally ready to actually practice with a roll of dummy film, I wanted to grab some scissors for this part because you will want to make sure that the film you're practicing with, the dummy roll, has a well-cut edge. And what I mean by a well-cut edge is it's not cut clean through the sprocket holes. This is a really well-cut edge. It's right outside the sprocket holes. It has a clean border. It's not going to get crimped and easily folded as I try to guide it through the reel. So if your dummy roll of film needs to be cut, cut that now. While in general, I don't want you to touch the face of the film and instead just try to touch the edges, this is the one part where you can kind of touch the face of the film just to keep it flat. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to locate those guide ridges and I'm going to slide the film underneath those onto kind of the outermost rung. I'm going to pull them past those metallic ball bearings. And at that point, I'll start doing that action that we already talked about, the back and forth. So if everything goes well, this shouldn't take more than 30 seconds to wind up on the reel. If anything goes wrong, you might notice the film doesn't load all the way or it loads really slowly. It is almost statistically impossible that your first roll of film will load perfectly, so it's good to know what to do in case something goes wrong. You can open a reel and loosen your film by holding firm with your left hand and pushing your right hand firmly to the front, and that kind of unlocks the reel so it's easy to take the whole thing apart. If things aren't going well, a good first stop when troubleshooting is to unlock the reel, take it apart, put it back together, which you can do by kind of doing the reverse motion. I'm showing that here. And then recutting the edge of your film and starting again. You should practice with dummy rolls a lot. I'm showing a slightly different way of holding my hands while I load film onto the reel. Here I just have my 2 forefingers on those guide ridges, so it's easy to feel where the film needs to go. So I'm just sliding it again right under those ridges, pulling it through. Sometimes you really need to pull it up and over those metallic ball bearings, so I'm doing that here. And I'm using the edges of my palms right under my thumb to kind of block the film from curling up too much. Sometimes the film curls so intensely right at the entrance of the guide ridge that it's hard to load it properly. So practice many, many times, figure out what works for you. Most importantly, you should get to the point where you can do this with your eyes closed, because you will, again, be loading your actual roll of film in complete darkness. It's also good to practice popping open the reel a few times and figuring out how to put it back together. I normally think of it like I'm putting my right hand a quarter turn ahead of my left and then locking it back so the guide ridges are aligned with each other. The only thing you can't really practice when you're loading dummy film is how you're actually going to get film out of that canister without exposing it to light. So this, again, and I cannot say this enough, will only happen for the real thing in total darkness. So you might want to decide before you go into the film loading room how you plan on opening that film canister. One way is to use this type of can opener. It's normally wall mounted, and you would slide the flat end of your film canister, again, in complete darkness. The flat end would go into the can opener itself, and then you would be able to pop open that side of the canister and slide your film out. One of the first things you'll notice when you do that is my film has this leader tail. You might actually remember this from loading film into the camera in the first place, but it's not quite as wide as the rest of the film. It's not going to be quite as wide as the rest of the reel. So the first thing you'll want to do is address that leader. You should also plan this before you enter the darkroom. This is a good technique for, again, avoiding hurting your hands, placing the film on a table surface, and then figuring out where your leader ends and trying to cut at about that end point. That was a pretty nice cut. It's not through sprocket holes. That would load pretty darn easily. So at this point, loading film onto the reel will hopefully be somewhat familiar since you've done this process outside of the dark space. But hopefully by this point, you're ready to do this completely again for the trillionth time in the dark. All of this dummy film being exposed to light means any nascent images are never going to be able to be developed. So it's important, again, to do this in complete darkness. Even if you are in a dark room, if you're in there for like 5 minutes and you start being able to see impressions of things or outlines of things, that means the room is too bright. Even when you go into the film loading room, you probably want to put that plastic bag, that trash bag that's in there at the base of the door to make sure no light creeps in. So when you get to your actual end of your actual roll of film, you will notice there's a center spool. That will also need to be cut off so that you can completely load the roll of film onto the reel. You will, at this point, in, again, total darkness, put your spool through your reel. Make sure that the spool is loaded ridge side down in the tank. Funnel is clicked firmly into place. And then you have your lid on your tank. At this point, you'll be able to leave the loading room and go into the light to develop film. That's as far as we'll get in part 1 of this video series. Just as a few reminders, practice with dummy film a lot. Plan out how you're going to operate loading film in total darkness. Think of how you want to lay out each component of your tank in a dark space so you can find it easily. Think of how you want to hold each individual reel. Think of how you want to cut your film, how you want to open your can. Plan it out so you don't put yourself under an unnecessary amount of stress the first time you do this process. Thanks for making it to the end, everyone. Good luck.